Hey, Clarice and Geoff, thank you for coming in. Both of you have just amazing backgrounds. Yeah, I mean, Clarice, you're the I would say the North Star of quantum biology. It's probably the world's most renowned expert in this area. You're kind of creating that space in many respects, and Geoff, of course, you're renowned in this area of doing nonprofits and the science space, and just doing really great work in terms of their uh, supporting research. And I can see the amalgamation of you two, the confluence you two will change the world forever in a very good way. So thank you for coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. Thanks for having us on.
So
Yes,
yeah, so one of the questions I always ask is, and I've done this with Clarice already because we've done a prior interview. So, and I asked, what were her inflection points to make this amazing career that she has. So I'm not going to ask that question again because the audience can go to the prior interview. But Geoff, what were the 2 to 3 sort of magic moments in your life that led to your wonderful career and your leadership today? That could have been something when you were 3 or 5, something in your family, outside your family. It could have been something in school, outside the school, maybe some early jobs you had, and so on.
Stephen, I need to say that I'm curious to as curious as you are to hear the answer because I don't know the answer to those.
Well, I feel like I've been blessed with a rich life, and so their perspective would, I think they thought it would turn me into a relativist and anti-realist. But the thing that actually happened was I read this book, and I highly recommend it to everyone listening to this. But it really helped me understand that science is more complex and more of a human-driven process than people frequently realize. So I'd say that was the first one, and I think that probably was when I was 17. I think then after that, so I got my PhD in philosophy, but while I was in school, I was really interested in understanding how to have a positive impact. I always thought that the way to do that was through doing good work in academia and publishing, and then the work being picked up. And actually in philosophy, that works really well. Like they're really good philosophy gets picked up really quickly. What I realized while I was doing my PhD is that while that can work, there are other avenues of impact that are possible. And so this inspired me to, while I was finishing up my PhD, to found Leverage, which is an independent nonprofit research institute. I basically figured out how to, build the thing from the ground up. But I ended up from this learning that it's possible to have impact both through academia and from outside it. My now preferred model is in collaboration. But so I'd say that was item number 2 that maybe happened. When was that? I'd have to guess, but I think maybe closer to being like 25 or 26. And then I think the third one I would mention as a sort of major inflection point was from talking. So I spent a bunch of time talking to venture capitalists in particular who focused on being able to identify which startups are going to work. That's what venture capitalists do, except that there are some that are trying to invest in science and technology, and they're doing it in areas that they don't have background in. So then this seems really hard. How can you tell if a startup in, a biotechnology startup is good if you don't have background in it yourself? Well, I met a bunch of venture capitalists who seemed to have sort of figured out how to do this. I found this really inspiring. The idea that you could approach a field from the outside and be able to assess it and figure out, essentially by understanding a bit of the science and a bit about people, what's actually happening in the field and which projects to bet on. So I think that was in, I'm going to say 2014 or so, maybe was around when that happened. So I'd say those are sort of 3 big inflection points for me.
So Geoff, what I'm hearing is you had this sort of early interest in science and sort of the broader philosophical, not just multi-stakeholder and interdisciplinary, but even transdisciplinary sort of thinking. And you integrated this into creating this nonprofit research institute
Yeah.
where you're able to identify bottlenecks in science and technology and advance the field, and really looking at the translational aspect. There's pure research, but it doesn't often go anywhere unless you translate something useful. And that coincided with your insight of seeing the VC marketplace and saying, hey, what if I can bridge those two of this amazing research that can be translated, and then actually getting funding for it so that you can scale it. It can have a global impact. And those are some of your defining moments in your life. And I guess the last defining moment is you met the #1 person in the world, Clarice, and in quantum biology, and she's actually looking at the translation of that, taking this, what used to be considered an outlier, but is now becoming more mainstream, and then practically, how can we use this to help healthcare, for example, and so on. So is that correct? She's
Yeah. Let me. I mean, I should just say one thing about this, and Clarice should say some stuff. But yeah, it was really quite funny. So it was about a year ago, and we got an email from Clarice Aiello. We had no previous experience with her or with quantum biology, and it really was just a cold reach out. And so, we respond to cold reach outs. And so, after a little while, I wrote back, and Clarice and I got on the line. And basically in the space of the first conversation, I'd say it was maybe 3 overall for us to really come to high conviction. But even in the first conversation, it was clear to us that essentially the science was solid here. The science was underappreciated, and that there was momentum in the area that conceivably could be harnessed to actually really push this field forward.
Yeah, and so Clarice, I mean, we had a prior interview, so let me try to summarize just some of the salient points of that interview in a few sentences.
Yes.
We have this area called quantum science, quantum information science and technology, and it's sort of a big area, and it's still new, relatively speaking. But then you said during the interview, well, not really, because people have been using it. I mean, semiconductors are actually based on it. They work on quantum science. You say GPS works on quantum science, lasers work on quantum science. And then you said, there's biology. There's this kind of magic stuff of this energy conversion that's happening in plants and photosynthesis, and classical ways of looking at it just do not account for how it works. So quantum is happening there. And then you gave another use case example of migratory patterns of birds and insects and things like that. And they're able to detect these really weak fields, and yet classical ways of thinking it don't explain it. So it's some kind of quantum aspect is happening it. So even though we don't have to 100% understand all of the aspects of quantum, we are already applying it already and have been for decades. And your thesis, and more than a thesis, you're actually doing it and saying, well, it's actually happening in biology all the time, and now let's look for practical solutions. Did I kind of capture what we had in
Yes, totally. I completely agree with the fact that we already live in a quantum world and have for decades, right? Again, lasers, magnetic resonance imagers that you find in hospitals, all of those things, and your classical computer, all of those things only work because of the laws of quantum physics, right? And very recently, people have been exploring these quantumness for things such as computing, communications, and so forth. And as you mentioned too, one underappreciated area has to do with the fact that there's tons of incomplete but somewhat very compelling evidence that biology runs on quantum. There are many examples of that. You mentioned 2 of the most researched ones, the fact that photosynthesis seems to be a process that is very efficient at converting energy. And the main way to see that today is photosynthesis is running on quantum in order to have this super high efficiency. You also mentioned the sensitivity of organisms such as birds and butterflies to weak magnetic fields, which is the flavor of quantum biology that is most that is closest to my heart. One thing that is, even though the poster children of the subfield are birds and butterflies, people have recognized and observed that the sensitivity to weak magnetic fields happens in a totally cell type and organism type agnostic way. So there are such effects observed from bacteria to mammals to amphibians and so forth. And again, this is not a basic science curiosity, right? From photosynthesis, you can learn how to build better solar cells. From learning how magnetic fields affect biology, and as you mentioned, the most the best candidate of an explanation involves quantum effects. Understanding how weak magnetic fields affect biology might have implications, and I'm going to lay down a lot of implications here, from national security to how to build better quantum technologies, to health, to space exploration, to longevity and performance enhancement. So it's not a basic science curiosity. What we're trying to do together with Geoff is to unblock quantum biology research by trying to access data that hasn't been accessed before, so that we can unambiguously prove or refute that biology runs on quantum, in order to learn how to deterministically control those endogenous degrees of freedom in biology with some application in mind, from, again, therapeutics to better quantum technologies.
Right, and then these better quantum technologies, as you mentioned, it could influence things like treatment of diseases, diagnostics of diseases. It can help in longevity, actually unlocking some of the areas associated with longevity. It can create better health outcomes just in general, right?
That's correct. And again, there is evidence that is compelling that the whole machinery of the cell seems to be in some way affected by those laws of quantum mechanics. So quantum biology is, in 95% of the cases, the study of how electromagnetics interact with matter, in this case, with living matter, right? If we can only understand deterministically how to tailor electromagnetic radiation to affect cell functioning in a very precise way, we can create new ways of curing disease, of improving performance. And in fact, let me get to the craziest example, which is space exploration, right? As you mentioned, birds and butterflies, they sense magnetic fields. What's not known is that, for example, if you raise organisms in chambers that shield out very, very, very well the tiny magnetic field of the Earth, which is orders of magnitude smaller than your cell phones, things go crazy. Embryos do not develop correctly, so, which is surprising. There is a quantum explanation consistent with that. But for example, if you want to colonize Mars or do multi-generational space travel, you don't only need to care about cosmic rays or microgravity. You also need to consider magnetic fields. So for example, the magnetic field on Mars is a tiny fraction of that on Earth. So can you space farm on Mars? Can you reproduce on Mars, right? So we believe that quantum biology has a gamut of potential applications that are very real and that just needs to be unblocked so that we can explore them to their fullest.
Do you use AI and machine learning in the applications and sort of the research in quantum biology?
We don't, and we think that there might be a link between quantum bio and AI in general. So here's how this goes. There's correlative evidence that cells need quantumness to function. And this is also true of neurons, right? So taken globally, if this is unambiguously proven, this might mean that a brain to function, in other words, to be conscious, would need some elements of quantum physics. So if we can, go for it, Geoff.
Yeah,
Finish we complete our reasonings.
Yeah, well, so there's some people are focused on the link from quantum to consciousness, but if we sort of put that aside, if you look at a lot of like the current LLMs are originally they're neural nets, they're based on the structure of the brain in terms of their inspiration, and so there's this interesting question of if neurons run on quantum, are there architectures that relate to that actually pertain in some way to intelligence? And then we don't know, but it's an interesting potential application.
Yeah, so Geoff, I mean, you're looking at, so describe to me what you hope to do from your nonprofit research institute side that identifies bottlenecks in science and technology and helps to advance the field. How do you want to advance this whole area, you specifically with your nonprofit research institute?
Absolutely. So we see ourselves as essentially playing a support role. Sometimes we select fields and do our own research. We're doing that right now in the history of science, where we're doing studies of the major discoveries in the history of electricity first to see if we can learn things that will then influence our understanding of how science operates in general, including today. So we do some of our own research, but in the case of quantum biology, we see ourselves again as playing a support role. We have helped Clarice, we connected Clarice with funding for, we're currently doing a replication of some of the, hypomagnetic chambers and raising tadpoles inside them to see what the effects are when you have organisms raised at very, very low levels of magnetic field. So connecting with funding, providing operational support, and then also thinking more generally.
On that, sorry, we need to mention a website. Just go to thetadpoleexperiment.org. We're going to be doing this public replication experiment in a completely open science manner. You're going to see all our data. Thetadpoleexperiment.org. I know, close.
Thanks, Clarice. But so our we essentially sort of take a step back and think about the field as a whole, and we think, what are the things that would be the most impactful for advancing it? In the case of quantum biology, what we've learned is that there's the subfield of quantum biology. And people in quantum biology are very, very familiar with the evidence that quantum physics or quantum phenomena is having an impact on a macroscopic level in biology. But as soon as you get outside the field, then people are much less familiar with this. And this is even though there's been circumstantial evidence of the link for the last 50 years. The perspective we came to was that the thing that needs to happen is there needs to be direct observational evidence of the existence of quantum phenomena for long enough to actually have biological impacts. It's like a way to say this is received wisdom is that quantum phenomena are very short-lived, and they affect things at the very small level. They can't last long enough to affect things macroscopically in practical cases. But then we have all the evidence of things like birds navigating using the magnetic field of the Earth, where the best explanation, the only known explanation for this is quantum. So then to move to the next step from circumstantial evidence to direct observational evidence, the thing that needs to happen is someone, and this is in fact Clarice's project, and why we're so excited about that project and trying to support it however we can. The project is to build a set of custom quantum microscopes and then use those to look inside cells and see how long superpositions are actually lasting for. if we have expectation that we'll see them lasting for long enough to be biologically relevant, it's always possible that that will end up not being the case. This is science. You get to find
And
the
that's
answer
not
when
super long. What we
Yeah.
mean by long enough, it's not long enough at the scale of minutes, on the scale of how biology operates. It's still much shorter, but it's on the order of nano to microseconds. Sorry.
Yeah, and so but essentially, we think that as soon as there is this more direct confirmation of the link, that's going to cause a lot more interest to come into the field. There are going to be like more funders are going to look at it, more scientists are going to look at it, and that will be because it will come to be generally known that, as Clarice said, biology runs on quantum.
So, and then you're going to get evidence, and then are you working on solutions, low cost, non-invasive, electromagnetic kind of solutions? Because then you can do some kind of deterministic ways of.
That's the next step. That is the next step. So the first thing we need is the quantum microscopes to be able to detect the quantum phenomena. Then once we can detect it, there's going to be a search for the best conditions under which to study how to optimize the interaction with it. But then the thing you want to do is figure out how to control it. There already are companies that are, as far as we or anyone can tell, are actually using the mechanism, but no one understands how the mechanism works mechanistically yet. So once we get to that phase, then it's at least our anticipation that there are going to be a large number of opportunities.
And
what you're saying then is there's already non-invasive electromagnetic treatments, maybe electric treatments as well that are non-invasive. The companies don't understand how it works, but it seems to work. And you're providing the underlying theory and then the proof experiment.
Well, and we want, so right now, in particular for this flavor of quantum biology having to do with how biology interacts with magnetic fields, people have been finding magnetic fields that do stuff for half a century, right? But there is no mechanistic understanding. Like, I liken it to being in a haystack, grabbing a little bit of hay and finding a needle. You cannot predict how magnetic fields will affect biology. You do a blind search, and sometimes you find something and you capitalize on that. For example, Novocure is a company that produces a weak electromagnetic field helmet that reduces the size of brain cancer in ways that they can't fully explain. The company is valued at multi-billion dollars. So imagine how much, not only in capital worth, but how much we could do for health if we had a deterministic way of predicting and understanding how magnetic fields affect biology and not doing this blind search.
Yeah, and I would say there's an example, Jeffrey Hinton and Ilias Seskova and team from the University of Toronto, not related to quantum biology, but they entered this contest called ImageNet, and they had a much lower error rating, and that completely transformed the space because it could be replicated. And then, of course, there was a lot of development and progression to the point where now people are saying maybe AGI is within a time frame, and there's application, just a lot of applications. Once you get that point to where other people can see it, they believe in it, then you'll get the applications. You're working on that as well on the early stages, so that's in your pipeline.
I would propose another analogy. So I mentioned we've been studying the history of electricity, and the thing that we now know that electricity is all over the place, and you can do completely amazing things with it. It's like the AI itself runs on a computer. The computer runs on electricity. If you go back to the very beginning, people had essentially no idea, at least as far as we've seen, that electricity was a special phenomenon that could take on all of these different forms and have all of these applications. And so, but if you imagine, if you think about the fact that all of life evolved in a quantum circumstance, it at least is prima facie plausible that biological cells, not just in sort of, small limited applications, but holistically evolved to take advantage of the quantum mechanism wherever they could. So it's we're hopeful that, I mean, we'll end up finding out how sort of deep the thing goes, but it's quite possible that you could end up with all sorts of applications that are ones that people aren't even thinking of right now, as the same has happened with electricity.
Yeah, or when they first created the first transistor, who would have thought that
Yeah.
releasing a Blackwell chip that has 200 billion transistors on it, right?
Right.
And that first transistor now driving biomedical innovation, climate, healthcare, AI, machine learning. I mean, fundamentally, there's chips behind all of it, right? These semiconductor
Yep.
chips.
And I just want to mention that someone who has been a supporter of our work is Federico Fagin, who is actually the inventor of the first microprocessor. So he's used to thinking ahead of time, and he's a supporter of our work. So yeah, it's just another fun fact that I thought I might drop here.
So so can you repeat the name again?
It's Federico Fagin. He's he has a book out where he talks about essentially the different journeys he's gone through, but it includes the invention of the microprocessor and the founding of a company later. And it's he's become interested in thinking about the effects of quantum on biology. And in his book talks through, and he's got things published on thinking about consciousness and how we might get to an understanding of that. But yeah, so he has a book out that people could look at.
So what are your timelines then? So Clarice, you're in the middle of the research side. What are your timelines from a research point of view?
Geoff, do you want to tackle that?
Yeah.
He's the main optimizer here.
Well, so we're still early in the optimization process. So it's so say we're going to try to make things faster. We're budgeting about 5 years for the first for this first phase. The back of the envelope, maybe it's 5 for the next. But we expect that again, the first phase is just the building of the microscopes and the confirmation of the quantum to biology link. The second phase is figuring out how to optimize the study and then being able to control aspects of cell function by interacting from the quantum side. And then in terms, some of the people we've spoken to, it's more than 5 years time frame in terms of looking for financial returns is too long. That's okay. I think there are plenty of investment opportunities for people who are looking on the shorter time frames. We've tried to be upfront with people that it's going to take a little while to actually get all the way through to the point where we understand quantum phenomena well enough to have deterministic effects. That said, yeah, go ahead.
That said, okay, timelines are exactly the same timelines that people take to build instruments for quantum science, for quantum computing, and so forth. So there is no shortcut that we can take there.
Yeah, I mean, we're optimistic, and speaking for Leverage here, that we'll find ways to be able to do things a bit faster than average. But yeah, right now we're budgeting 5 years for the first part, and then we expect a whole lot of interest to come in after that and occur concurrently with the next phase of the research.
So I'm really curious. I mean, you're funding Clarice's work as a nonprofit research institute. How do you get your funding?
Oh, well, so we should distinguish the we're helping Clarice to raise funding. We ourselves are independently funded. Historically, so in terms of where money comes from for both of the organizations, so there's been some from tech investors who are interested in pushing forward future technology and who are willing to sort of grapple with the fact that that sometimes takes a bit of time. Also, we've had some success interacting with the crypto community. There are a bunch of people in cryptocurrency who are interested in decentralized science, and more generally interested. A lot of the people who adopted crypto did so because they're interested in new and future technologies. So we've had some success there, though I should note that while Leverage is helping Clarice raise money, we've interacted with a whole bunch of groups. So there's we've interacted with academic groups that have interest, and so we're for the next phase of the quantum bio or the QuBiT's the name of the lab, the QuBiT experiment, that we're expecting money to come in essentially from a bunch of different angles.
So that's really interesting in terms of your pipeline and how you're taking this forward, and the time frames. We're seeing a confluence, right? New semiconductor technology. There's Philip Wong at Stanford. He's doing amazing work. He's even got chips that they're inserting into cells, and they can wirelessly communicate with chips and cause those chips to perhaps influence behavior of those cells and also act as sensors and things like that.
I propose that we don't even need to implant anything. I propose that just with magnetic fields, we could maybe get to the same point.
Yeah, though maybe some of the work that he's doing, because computer chips are working at the quantum level, right? So maybe some of the work that he's doing can influence some of the work that you're doing in some way, or if you had a discussion with him at Stanford. I'm just kind of thinking out of the box here.
Well, one thing is we've realized, as Clarice and I have been talking about quantum biology and about how it relates to different fields. There are actually a lot of different aspects of research that can be pushed forward if quantum biology advances. One that is very interesting is quantum computing, where the challenge, there's a number of different challenges. Sort of we're not yet close to there being sort of functional or commercially viable quantum computers. One of the challenges that needs to be met is the question of coherence and decoherence of quantum states. You need the quantum states to last long enough at room temperature. Something that's very interesting is that if this hypothesis, quantum biology, that there is this quantum to bio link, then what that means is that there are quantum states that are lasting for long enough inside cells, which exist at room temperature. That's the sort of thing that could be studied by quantum computing, not because it's going to directly necessarily translate, but because you're going to get all sorts of ideas for how do quantum states work, and potentially some of those may open up research avenues in quantum computing.
Because nature seems to be a very good decoherence quencher, right? Apparently, if the quantum biology hypothesis is unambiguously proved, this is evidence that nature has developed over billions of years strategies to decrease the damage done by decoherence.
Yeah, I mean the whole area of quantum computing or quantum information technology and science is progressing really, really quick. And I mean, there's new discoveries or improvements happening continuously, right? In fact, there was a recent announcement between Microsoft and Quantinuum. Quantinuum is a combination of, we used to be Honeywell Quantum Computing and Cambridge and then they
Yep.
created Continuum. But then Microsoft, working with them, made this announcement that they were able to improve kind of the error ability, something like about 800 times, right? Where you
Mhm.
get relatively stable or more stability in these logical qubits, right? So then you can start doing real work with it. Then it's a matter of scaling. Or there's N quantum Monte Carlo simulations being applied to business and also to physics and so on. So there's a lot of work in narrow niches that have commercial applications even today. That's the feeling today, even though a universal quantum computing may be a few years off, but it's hard to predict because things are happening so quickly, just like an AI machine learning. If you asked Jeffrey Hinton 3 years ago that you'd have
Oh,
to,
certainly.
he would have said, no, it's probably would have said it's 50 years out or something. He has changed what he's saying publicly now, right?
Yeah, no, that's why and then we're really hopeful that I think, essentially the looking at, and then this is with the microscopes that the QuBiT project will be building, these just don't exist right now. And so this is an avenue forward that quantum research groups could conceivably take advantage of, but they can't right now because the microscopes don't exist. And so we're hoping that by going in this direction, we're going to unlock more research paths, and that'll make it easier to make breakthroughs, for example, in quantum computing.
So these quantum microscopes, are you using, like femto laser kind of technology or something like that?
No, they're composed of 4 ingredients. It's a microscope coupled to a magnetic field source, coupled to coils or a magnet, everything synchronized down to the nanosecond, because those are the timescales of relevance for the phenomena that we want to study, and with very good single photon detectors, because for the quantum people in the audience, by measuring different fluorescence levels, we can do quantum state readout. Sorry, that was technical, but it's a glorified microscope, but it's also a true quantum instrument that we want to start to apply to read out quantum states inside biology.
I see. So you're applying some genetic editing then for the fluorescence of the.
No, that's the coolest part. Those all of this is endogenous. There's no need to do any gene editing. All those degrees of freedom, all these readout capabilities already exist. And this is why we're super pumped about the possibility of using that, say, for health applications. There's no need for genetic editing of any type.
So
Isn't this cool?
So what you're saying is that you're going to apply different electromagnetic fields to some cells or tissues. You're able to detect, or you're building the capability to detect fluorescent emissions, which will be like a marker that there's some quantum aspects happening, and you can measure this, right? Is that what you're saying?
Yes.
That's interesting. So your microscope then would have really ultra sensitive receptors, right, or sensors of some sort, right? So.
And all of this is needed for us to establish what I'm tentatively calling the code book on how to tweak those degrees of freedom in biology for function. Once you learn the rule, you don't need this readout anymore. Then, because we're talking about weak magnetic fields, then your healing power would be, say, in an app in your phone, right? Maybe you can think that you can load an app in your phone with this code book, with said code book, and then you would go there and say, well, today I need help with wound healing. And then you click there and your cell phone produces the exact magnetic field frequency and intensity that you need, and then you would go like this. This would have huge implications for like global health and other super cool stuff.
Yeah, if you understood it in a deterministic way, what the relationships are, not just correlation but causation as well, then you can make any sort of an infinite number of applications.
Exactly. You don't need a complicated instrument to actuate on those things, right? You can do that with a cell phone, but to learn more in a way that goes beyond the the needle in a haystack sort of picture, you need those quantum instruments.
Right, and then you can scale it to anything, right? Because once you could put it in a device, and it could be inexpensive, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. It could be developing regions, well-developed regions, everybody will have access, and then it's a game changer. Then from a company standpoint, you have a kilocorn. Now, this is not a recommendation of endorsement or anything like that. Just saying, I'm just thinking, then you'd have $1 trillion startup, just like NVIDIA now has over 2 trillion, right? So,
well, these are all the reasons that we're so excited about the area. The thing that we were amazed by coming in was that, and this became clear on our first call with Clarice, is that the science side of it is really good. It's like the sorts of effects that we're expecting to see have already been demonstrated in laboratory conditions. So it's like we have that, and then there's a question of, do the same things happen in cells? And then there's like more than 50 different places where we've seen evidence of effects that this is the best known explanation for it. So from a Bayesian perspective, thinking about the evidence, the case seems really strong.
right, and then you're open sourcing it as well, right? You're going to openly publish it. You can inspect. You're going to say, this is how we did it. They can try it. And
yeah,
so,
we're planning. So one thing that it turned out both Clarice and I were really excited about was open science. And then sometimes open science is used as a corrective, where people are trying to correct some aspect of a pre-existing and established field. But in this case, we think that open science can be built in from the beginning as a sort of way of showing people how all of this is supposed to be done. So we've been thinking about, and in fact, with the tadpole experiment, this is being
Say the
done.
website. Say the website.
Yeah. Was it www.thetadpoleexperiment.org? Yep. Okay. Learning about promotion. But yeah, we're planning to have, not just the results, but the process as we go through and do each of the different parts of the experiments. This will make it so that it's much easier for people to replicate. It's much easier for people to learn from, and it'll help get the people involved in a way that isn't trying to simplify. It's bringing them into contact with science as we're actually doing it.
yeah, and in fact, by employing some of the scaling foundation models out there, they may have been leading you to a quicker path in the optimization of this microscopes, and then even the application of it afterwards, right? Because you don't know what GPT or the equivalent to GPT-7 is going to look like.
Well, yeah, I mean, so if this is, and so I mean, while our work with Clarice is not about AI, it's just about quantum bio, but we look at AI independently. And I think on the AI front, a lot depends on essentially what happens as the models continue to scale. They have data as an input, they have compute as an input, and then everything is running on the transformer architecture. And so there's a lot depends on what happens. Are we hitting the limits to the total amount of data? What happens if you put 100 or 1,000 times more compute through it? So this is something that is obviously really important. If we're planning on using anything that comes out of AI to help us insofar as possible. Thus far, the LLMs don't, as far as we can tell, have the power to help with any of the things we're doing, but we're certainly open depending on how things develop.
Yeah, or this idea that the LLMs, there seems to be kind of a linear, or at least, or maybe even exponential kind of increases in capability the more you scale it. And I guess there was a paper that came out a few months ago now, and there was articles on it on random graph theory, where there's sort of a well-established area, and they applied it to try to figure out what's happening with these LLMs. And there's this idea that the nodes are appearing, you're picking them at random, but what you're finding is that the edges are forming and they're being reinforced. And then some of these graphs are being removed. And so there's skill development, and then they're being combined in novel ways. And so there's something like some kind of understanding that's happening. So beyond this probabilistic thinking, and that's very useful for you, especially when the next iteration comes out, like GPT-5 or its equivalent to GPT-6.
Yeah, I mean, the one thing we're especially interested in is whether the LLMs get the ability to produce counterintuitive observations. There's, in the case of quantum biology, a number of people have found it counterintuitive because the way everyone learns about quantum mechanics is that it's only supposed to apply to things that are really small. Cells aren't that small. And so it's people's sort of reflexive.
Small in code, small in code.
That's right, small and very low temperatures. So it's people's reflexive reaction that how will quantum states last for long enough in the environment of the cell. But then on the other hand, there's all of this varied circumstantial evidence. And then this is a question that we've had and have discussed with a number of people in sort of in and around the AI field. Can the LLMs get to counterintuitive conclusions? And so far, what we've seen, GPT-4 and equivalent, not as much. And so that I think is a really key and interesting benchmark, because when you expect some of advancing science is more firepower, more computation, but a whole bunch of it is being able to recognize anomalies and then overcome the sort of instinctive let's say the habit of ignoring things like that.
Yeah, so I postulate that that's already occurring, right? So and then if you extrapolate beyond that, then I think it'll be definitely useful for you, including some of the work that's even occurring in the quantum computing area as well, right? Some of the rapid advances that are occurring. So, and I think that'll lend more weight to what you're doing. Do you have any other sort of big ideas that you want to present that are related to this work in quantum biology? So you mentioned some of it already, but are there others that are really kind of outliers and there's a non-zero chance so that this could come about through your work?
Geoff, do you want to talk about national security maybe?
So we have been talking to different people connected to national security establishment, and like essentially there are almost all biological research ends up being dual use in one way or another. One thing we were quite encouraged by is that when you're interacting with cells at this level, they have essentially cells evolve to maintain homeostasis, which means that you essentially trying to disrupt them is non-trivial. It's the sort of thing that it's theoretically possible, but we want to encourage people to go in the positive directions rather than the negative. So I do think, so there is that element. I was thinking of something just a little bit more sociological, which was that one thing that we found from talking to different people about quantum biology is that it seems like a lot of the different areas that when we think about how can we get science and technology to advance more quickly, essentially we've been very encouraged to the degree to which people have become interested in quantum biology as a result of seeing how it relates to their own specific area of interest. It's not that they're necessarily quantum biology super fans or anything like that, but they do care about Mars, and they do want us to live on Mars, and they do care about weak magnetic field effects as a result, or they care about quantum computing, or they're in the pharmaceutical industry. And we've been talking to people and a number of different firms there, and apparently the mechanism of action for different pharmaceuticals is frequently not well understood. There's an indication that maybe it's the quantum effect happening there as well. So we have just been very, very encouraged by the way that this field relates to many others. And so it's our hope that if we can make progress here, because it relates to so many other fields, it's also going to cause progress in the other fields as well. And so that's not taking one trend and extrapolating it to infinity. I think, Stephen, you did a great job with that earlier. I'm imagining more of like a broad-based extrapolation where you make progress in one area and it unlocks progress in all of the adjacent areas.
Yeah, it could be catalytic, actually.
Yeah, that's a great word for it.
Yeah, it won't be just a small linear
Yeah.
transformation of each one of the areas it hits, right? Because it's so foundational.
Yeah, and it will, I think, lead a lot of people to really start rethinking how they're thinking about biology, but then also related fields. When we've had conversations with people, they haven't really interacted with quantum biology. They learn about the current state of evidence, and then they're like, well, okay, well, if the effect is actually real, then probably it's happening all over the place because cells did evolve in a quantum environment and so are more likely to take advantage of whatever they can as the part of the process of evolution. And so they're already making leaps that the sort of scientific consensus will be able to make once we get the direct observational evidence. So I think there's like a lot of potential energy to get unlocked here.
Yeah, or even the idea that it's more than an idea. There's evidence that there's some kind of computational ability in individual cells in our body.
Mm.
And people are always so neuron specific, but now they're seeing other things that are computationally meaningful that are not in neurons. And what are the implications of that, right? So we always measure the raw ability of our brain by, let's say, 80 to 100 billion neurons and let's say 100 trillion synapses, but there's other stuff going on that is also computationally meaningful. So it's much bigger number. And then even if you look at individual cells and what's happening, it's a much bigger something is happening. Or when they apply LLMs to communications and interspecies understanding, and then they're finding, gee, there's this hive capability of problem solving in a way that works like our hive, which is our brain, really a hive of neurons, right? Like you can have this discrete bodies that operate almost like the way our brain works, right? So,
yeah, we were just talking to a researcher earlier today who was postulating this sort of communication function for mitochondria. It was a really interesting sort of counterintuitive thought. But yeah, it's some people think that, science is basically done and we know all the things we're going to know, but you look across the history of science, every 50 years, every 100 years, things advance rapidly. AI is the thing happening now. There's a question of what's going to happen next.
yeah, the counterfactual thinking, which was a big premise and papers written by Judea Pearl, was really the foundation of a lot of the progress we made in AI machine learning, right? Not just looking at the facts of something occurred, but then saying, well, what if this what would be the result? What are the implications of outside of the known facts, and what the implications, and that gives you a much better understanding decision making and how it manifests. And then, of course, the counterfactual, I think, are sort of related in a way, right? So, last question then. What are your sort of recommendations to the audience, both Clarice first, you, and then Geoff?
Recommendations on what? On what to read to learn more about quantum bio?
I should probably plug the tadpole experiment website again.
The tadpoleexperiment.org. There is a layperson's book talking about different flavors of quantum biology by Jim Al-Khalili and John McFadden called Life on the Edge. That's
So
a very...
Can I pause you then?
Yes.
Can you put that in your profile? So you're both of you
I will.
You submit the profile. I want you to list the website, all of the additional resources.
Yes.
So that people can...
We will.
On this journey. Remember, you can make it as long as you want, right?
Yeah. And one final recommendation is, again, bringing this conversation to the beginning, right? We already live in a quantum world. We don't need to think about quantum computing, not even quantum bio. We already live in a quantum powered world. I would suggest that everyone gets a modicum of education in the quantum sciences as a way to increase the way that you understand how our world works.
So Clarice, again, then, if you can give graded kind of different levels of accessing this material, so kind of a layman's version, somebody who is scientifically curious.
Will do. And also, it's not immediate, but this is going to take time. But I am also writing what's probably going to be the first textbook on quantum biology. But we can talk about it again in 1.5 years.
Okay, so why don't you put that in your profile? In mid 2025, your book is going to come out, which will be a seminal book in terms of understanding the science behind it.
It needs to finish getting written first, so I'm hopeful that it will. But
you could say target. Okay, so that means your profile is going to be a really useful resource for the audience, right? Including linking to videos you think that are appropriate for this thing as well. Okay, Geoff.
Yeah, so I would just so obviously read all the information that we put into the profiles. That's something that I would recommend. But sort of picking up on the last point that you made, Stephen, about counterfactuals and about thinking, a lot of progress has been driven by people inspired by science fiction. I mean, you see, it's like the metaverse comes out of, Neil Stephenson's work, and I mean, just in general, anybody working in these areas, they frequently were inspired by science fiction. A lot of the actual advances that end up happening do end up being really different, though, than people imagine. Sometimes people get it right, Ender's Game with the internet, but it can be really hard to think through. And so the thing I want to encourage everyone to do is to try to imagine different possible futures. A lot of science fiction nowadays is darker or more pessimistic, but the challenge is trying to think about an optimistic, realistic future. In that connection, an organization that leverages fiscally sponsoring called the Foundation for Future Aesthetics. They publish a right now online, but will become a print magazine called Possibilia. Check out possibiliamag.com, and I'll include that as a link. But what this magazine is for optimistic, realistic sci-fi, and trying to imagine all sorts of different possibilities for how the future could actually happen and be great. So that's something that I recommend to everyone.
Well, those are really meaningful resources that people could consume and be inspired by, and lead them into action as well. And maybe it'll stimulate additional ideas that they'll execute on. So that I hope. Okay, well, I really appreciate you both coming in. As I mentioned, Clarice, you have just a marvelous background. You're definitely a transformational thinker. And then Geoff, you're enabling all of that as well. You're supporting it through your nonprofit research institute, and you described your journey to where you are today. And I can see the both of you as a confluence of producing much more than the sum of the parts because of what you're bringing to the table, right? So very complementary. I thought it was a really interesting interview. I really enjoy these ones where we explore different spaces together.
Thanks, Stephen.
Thank you for coming in and sharing your insights with our audience.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you for listening to the Brand Called You videocast and podcast, a platform that brings you knowledge, experience, and wisdom of hundreds of successful individuals from around the world. Do visit our website www.tbcy.in to watch and listen to the stories of many more individuals. You can also follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Just search for the Brand Called You.